Urban landscapes are changing constantly. New apartment buildings, highway expansions, and all manner of construction projects define and redefine a city, changing the look, the feel, and cultural meaning of an area. Like a block of historic homes that are now a stadium, a factory for a long-gone industry turned into an entertainment district, or a lost historic cemetery, rediscovered and soon to be lost again. A city's historic and cultural sites often lose their place and memory in this pattern of destruction and urban renewal. Compliance archaeologists play key roles in the preservation of a city's historic and cultural sites, extracting and documenting as much data as we can through our methods of controlled destruction. However, preserving a site's place and space in the urban landscape is something that in the past, compliance archaeologists have been mostly unable to do. And it is in this context we find the Estuary Cemetery, a forgotten memory of American expansionism in the heart of downtown Tampa. Making its first appearance in Tampa's urban landscape on an 1838 map of Fort Brooke, the Estuary Cemetery is closely tied to the fort and the battles for American expansion that it fought. Tied not only in space, but time as well, the Estuary Cemetery appears on several of Fort Brooke's maps. Military correspondences and post returns also make repeated reference to the Estuary Cemetery throughout Fort Brooke's use by the U.S. military. It is after Fort Brooke's decommissioning in 1882 that this estuary cemetery is abandoned. By the early 20th century, the cemetery was forgotten. However, not undisturbed. The Estuary Cemetery would be affected by a number of 20th century construction projects, most devastating being the construction of Browring Street in the 1970s. The Estuary Cemetery would not appear on Tampa's urban landscape again until 2018.
The latest chapter was unearthed north of Channelside in the midst of the $3 billion Water Street Tampa project. Workers discovered the long-abandoned Estuary Cemetery.
Though an exciting discovery, it is not necessarily a unique one. The Tampa Bay area itself has had numerous bodies and lost historic cemeteries pop up in the past 3 years. Modern cities often contain sites like this, places of past hardships, forgotten, ignored, and erased. When it comes to sites like the Estuary Cemetery, sites related to colonial violence and white supremacy, their erasure is a great danger to the people of the present, particularly Black and Indigenous people of color. It is important for archaeologists to preserve these sites and the painful memories they hold, making modern people address the legacies of historic violence. In the 1970s and 80s, when Germany was exploring ways to atone for the Holocaust, an important discussion was being had about historic sites and memorials. After the end of the Second World War, the former headquarters of the Gestapo remained abandoned and in ruin. In 1982, when the city government proposed a memorial to the victims of the Holocaust at the location, people feared that this would create a false sense of closure, ending public debate and questioning of Nazi Germany's crimes and legacy. Instead, an alternative was proposed and implemented. The ruins of the former Gestapo headquarters would remain as an open wound or a gap in the urban landscape that would provoke passerby and visitors by its unusual sense of non-urban emptiness. It would be an archaeological site, preserved behind glass and in a constant state of excavation, exposing the everyday materials of state violence. People would see themselves in the familiar banality of the office setting, identify with it, all while being deeply uncomfortable. In the writing on the archaeology of perpetrators, and this site in particular, Reinhard Bernbeck and Susan Pollack consider this moment of discomfort and identification a dialectical contradiction, where our familiarity and comfort with the material culture of an office space meets our knowledge and discomfort with the horrors of the Holocaust. Out of this contradiction, dispute and discord on the past and its relationship to our present emerge. It is a kind of Brechtian alienation effect that is frequently experienced at archaeological sites, which can be broadly thought of as sites of spatial and temporal abnormality. When considering the prevalence of stone circles in the folk horror genre, archaeologist Katie Soar had this enlightening thing to say. They exist on the edges of the rational world, where chronological rules have less meaning. Here, multiple times coexist, and the borders between the present and the past become destabilized. Nevertheless, it is not just in the physical world that archaeological sites spark feelings of discomfort and alienation, but in the virtual world and in 3D reconstructions as well. Virtual Rosewood is an immersive walking simulator that used archaeology to recreate the town of Rosewood, Florida, as it would have been before its destruction in the 1923 race pogrom, commonly referred to as the Rosewood Massacre. Walking around the town is a surreal and meditative experience. With only a few informative placards and no direction, you find yourself wandering around with nothing but your thoughts and the knowledge that the town you are experiencing no longer stands in the world where you live. Like with the stone circles, your comfort in linear time trembles. Existing before you is the past and the present that you inhabit. Their connections and how they have shaped each other reveal themselves. By letting a site of past violence exist as an open wound in either the physical or the virtual world, people have to reconcile the connections the present they live in has to past atrocities like the Holocaust, the Rosewood Massacre, or America's expansion into stolen native land. However, it is not every day in CRM that archaeologists get to tell a developer that they cannot build in a prime location in the heart of a downtown district, or that we have the budget to create a fully immersive 3D virtual world. As has been stated previously, how do we preserve a site's place and memory in the urban landscape when the site can no longer occupy that space? The answer to that lies in photogrammetry and low-altitude drone mapping. For the Estuary Cemetery relocation project, a wealth of digital data was created. For each archaeological feature identified, we created geo-referenced photogrammetric models. We also conducted low-altitude drone photography to create orthomosaic images of the entire site. Created predominantly for lab analysis, their potential to preserve the site's urban context became eminently clear. Several ideas were bounced around when we were conducting the fieldwork on how best to capture the site's urban setting. One was to follow the example of virtual Rosewood and create a walking simulator where you could explore the site and come across the models of the features in their partially excavated form. Tampa's skyline, of course, would be visible in the distance. We were also inspired by the work done at Kingsley Plantation, where 3D reconstructions of the buildings, including the no longer standing slave cabins, could be viewed in Google Earth, our plan being to place the site's orthomosaic into Google Earth similarly. But these ideas were decided against for a few reasons. To speak on one, the walking simulator was deemed impossible to complete in a timely and budget-friendly manner. So instead, we looked at what we could accomplish with the models, geodata, and programs that we had at our disposal. Using ArcScene, we were able to place the orthomosaic and feature models in relationship with the 20th century disturbances, such as the construction of Browring Street and a pit of oyster shells from a restaurant that once occupied the location. In this image, we meet the Estuary Cemetery. All the time that passed since it was abandoned has been stripped away by heavy machinery and the shovel and trowel of archaeologists, whose presence is felt on the site's periphery. Here is the mid-19th century, the time of Fort Brooke, the period of American expansionism. It is a time far from our own, but all these photos stitched together make it real, make it familiar. This lies in contrast with the temporal events nearest to us, the 20th century disturbances. Seen here, not as photorealistic representations of themselves, but as abstract and hulking blobs of color. Browring Street, a street that you may have driven on before, a street as generic and familiar as any, has been made unfamiliar. These two contrasting images existing not just in relationship with each other, but also within our knowledge that that plot of downtown Tampa looks drastically different today. When we see the 3D models in relationship with the 20th century disturbances, here a horse burial that is partially under a sidewalk, it becomes intimate and personal. The horse is displaced from any larger spatial context. The Estuary Cemetery in the city of Tampa is nowhere to be seen. The horse, a classic symbol of American expansion, exists only in relationship with the sidewalk. However, since it is not any sidewalk in particular, it can be any and every sidewalk you've walked on. It raises the question of what relationship the sidewalks you've walked on today have to the violence of American expansionism. By preserving the Estuary Cemetery in its urban context, we don't just start to understand the relationship between modern-day Tampa and American expansionist violence, but we start to question what connections the cities and towns we live in have to this violent history, as well as the ways that we ourselves might be continuing this violence. Here again, the presence of archaeologists can be felt, this time in the calibrated scale bars surrounding the remains of the horse. I found it important to include the presence of archaeologists in the models. One reason was to add to this sense of permanent excavation, but another was to create self-awareness and reflexivity. I was inspired by visual anthropologist Kathleen Ramey. In her reflexive documentary films, she employs various experimental film techniques, predominantly optical printing, to show how filmmakers play a role in constructing historical narratives that lead to oppression, and how filmmakers can derail those same narratives. It must be made apparent how archaeologists are connected to these legacies of violence, especially colonialism, and when those connections are understood, they can be dismantled. By utilizing the geodata that already exist for many archaeological projects and combining it with new media like photogrammetry, we can preserve sites and inspire discussion about the past in ways archaeologists haven't before. In the future, we hope to work with the Tampa History Center on an exhibit about Fort Brooke and the Estuary Cemetery. The History Center is just across the street from the urban development that now stands where the cemetery was. To see the Estuary Cemetery in the virtual world, in its state of excavation, in its context and contradiction with the 20th century, and then to walk outside and see how the urban landscape has changed is an experience that I can't begin to fathom.